Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to the third in our Transform Digest series, the Trust Fabric session. Super excited to have such a great slate of panelists this morning to join us. My name is Sarah Bodine, and I lead marketing communications and partner marketing here at ZEDEDA. And I'm super excited this morning to have Mic Bowman from Intel, Steve Todd from Dell, and Matt Yarger from the IOTA Foundation. And I thought we could start, gentlemen, if we can just do a quick round robin of intros. Maybe let's start with you, Matt, if you want to give just sort of a sense of who you are, what you do, that would be awesome.
Yeah. So I'm Matt Yarger. I am currently the head of smart mobility at the IOTA Foundation. Previously held the roles of head of smart cities, public sector product owner, and research engineer and security specialist. Been with the foundation since about late 2017, working in DLT and blockchain and working on a lot of our frameworks and developments there, and predominantly centralized around data and how we can use data to change digital public infrastructure. And I have a background before that with 10 years at the NSA and Department of Defense doing cybersecurity, cyber operations, and digital forensics. So happy to be here.
Awesome. Awesome. Thanks, Matt. How about you, Steve?
Hey everybody, Steve Todd from Dell Technologies. I'm a fellow in the office of the CTO. My background is really as a software engineer, building trusted storage systems for Dell EMC. And I think that'll become important as we talk about the definition of a trust fabric, right? How can we think of the delivery of trusted data in a data center? How does that translate to the edge? And what is the trust fabric? So looking forward to chatting with these guys today.
Awesome. Awesome. Yeah. And we'll keep this super conversational, right? This will be a lot of fun, I think, today. And then Mick, you as well?
Sure. So I'm Mic Bowman. I run the Trustworthy Distributed Systems Group in Intel Labs, which is really about kind of how we develop trust in multi-party distributed systems. And so we've been kind of the center of excellence for blockchain work and distributed ledgers in Intel since maybe as early as 2014, 2015. And a lot of our work now focuses on high integrity and confidential computing.
Awesome. Awesome. Yeah, I think this is, you guys have such diverse backgrounds, right? That this is going to make this a really interesting conversation. And I think, Steve, let's start going back to you, because you kind of led us into it, right? Where you started talking about the definition of a trust fabric, right? So I wonder if we can just start there for the audience. You know, when we talk about trust fabrics, what are we talking about?
Well, trust fabric is a response to a problem, right? And that problem is, by some estimates, 70% of data that'll be analyzed by 2025 will be outside the context of a secure data center, i.e. in an edge environment, right? And I mentioned my background inside the data center is working with companies like Intel, building this trusted hardware path inside a company that gave applications confidence in the data that they were processing, right? So now, as we move outside of a data center, you know, Dell is still working with companies like Intel on building this trusted data path, but the attack surface is so much larger. The heterogeneity of the vendors, the geographies that the data is crossing, we really needed to do something a little bit new. And that idea is to build what we call a trust fabric, where all the data that flows across it can be measured in terms of its trustworthiness, right? And it has to be an explicit measurement, right? We can't just assume the data is good. And that's where we started looking for partners like IOTA, right? Can we use the emerging technology called distributed ledger to have this annotation sidecar that rides alongside the data? So a trust fabric can be thought of, hey, is a data fabric, usually on the edge, that has this trustworthy annotation sidecar that rides alongside of it, where you can actually keep score of data and how trustworthy it is. So again, trust fabric is all about a fabric that has the ability to measurably trust your data.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful. Matt, Mick, anything to add to that in terms of how you're thinking about trust fabrics that might be useful to the audience?
So I guess I would start by saying that there's a fundamental shift that's happening in security just in general, that we've built all of our security principles around this idea that the application is the center. We have antiviral tools that allow us to check to see if there's malicious software embedded inside our applications. We are working really hard to secure the software supply chain, and we'll come back to that probably later. But all of this focus on the applications is missing the fact that we have shifted to the point where the data is the application. That because so much of our work is now focused on machine learning and AI, where we're taking large chunks of data to train the behavior, and the application is, the code that's running is really just an inferencing engine over some very domain-specific data. And so establishing the trustworthiness of the data has become, in some ways, the central security problem of defining the trustworthiness of the applications that we run.
Yeah, absolutely. I like to use a term or like a thought process, I guess, of now with DLT and blockchain and everything, we're starting to be able to move into this new way of developing applications where it's more like a prove it way of functioning. So before you process anything or look at anything, we can actually scale out proofs all the way to where the data is generated and embed it directly in the data at a really granular level. So it's almost like a prove it economy starting to form in different layers of how this functions with different blockchains, et cetera. So I think that's really what having a trust fabric creates and enables at a really large scale, is for individuals and organizations to start to have some degree of transparency while still retaining their intellectual property and their business property and all that kind of stuff, but sharing just enough to where they can start to trust each other autonomously. And the devices that are sharing the data, creating data, or interacting with each other to enable applications can start to trust each other autonomously. Because we have to get to that point for applications and solutions to really start to scale to the next stage of where we're going.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And then to kind of go from there into the next question, right? And I think you're starting to touch on this, Matt, when you talk about sort of enabling sort of new like economies and things like that. Why is trust fabrics going to be a critical enabler when it comes to digital transformation, right? We know that digital transformation can't happen without edge computing in some fashion, right? That's pretty accepted at this point. But why is trust fabrics going to be so critical in this?
I like what Matt said about prove it everywhere, right? So if you can think about every possible exchange that happens between an application and data, between the creation of that application, its deployment, the journey that the data takes, because the entire environment is so untrusted, every question needs to start with, well, prove it before I even start working with you, prove who you are, right? And I think you're talking about zero trust architectures.
Exactly.
Absolutely.
And so because the edge especially is so untrusted, trust fabric become this critical enabler. Mm-hmm. If you build some sort of fabric over when data is flowing across it, at every opportunity, if you have the opportunity to ask, prove it to me, the more proof that you get, the higher your confidence goes, right? And if you can't get that proof that you want, you can assume the data might not be trustworthy, right? And you can actually change your business logic to say, because I'm not sure, I may not take this action on the factory floor. Because if I do, I may be making a bad business decision. But if you can make provable decisions that you know where the source of the data came from and you know who's handled it, then we need to teach our business logic about that. As Mick said, right? It's less about trusting the application now and more about trusting the data bits themselves.
So there's another part of this transformation that's happened, which is, in the old days, whatever that means, that the data provider was the developer, was the consumer of the application, right? We generate our data, we build an application, do the analytics over it, we outsource it to the CSP, and then we run the analysis and we get the results back. But right now, a lot of the data that we're computing on is not our data, or it didn't originate with us, but we have a deep dependency on the trustworthiness of that data. And so now we have to do this negotiation between sort of the consumer and the analysis of data and the providers of the data, and establishing the trustworthiness in these, well, as we've said, in these zero trust environments. That's really the challenge.
Yeah.
One more thought I had, Sarah, was why are companies deploying applications? Well, in general, they're hoping for favorable business outcomes, right? An increase in revenue, a reduction in operating expenses, a reduction in risk, right? That's why they have the applications. If they send an application out onto some untrusted environment and make the wrong decisions based on untrustworthy data, now you're hurting the business, right? You're potentially introducing yourselves to fines instead of revenue, right? Or you're making an operational decision which loses money instead of saves money. So that's why trust fabrics are an enabler for digital transformation, especially on the edge, because without them, you're losing money, right? That's the negative way to look at the disadvantages of not having them.
Yeah, and that's really what we think we'll see from a consumer and from a business perspective, like moving forward, is organizations wanting to be able to have that level of trust built into the process, so that they're building a sustainable and like long-term relationship, either with their consumers or their clients, customers, or with the businesses that they're operating and building solutions with. Because if you're incorporating data from one solution and the data ends up being really faulty, then you start to lose trust in the organization that you're getting that data from. Because as y'all said, we're not producing the data and assessing it and building applications around it anymore. These are all done with multiple different organizations. So it's become a highly fractured environment, and we need some kind of underlying fabric that allows us to decrease what those fractures really mean. So there's not as big of a gap between what we're doing and what you're doing and how we interact together in a digital context. I mean, you can see this in a lot of different ways too. Like in the blockchain native space right now, there's a huge conversation going on around arts and non-fungible tokens or NFTs, and people that are taking people's art, putting it onto these platforms, selling it. And there's no way to actually know if you can trust these individuals that are putting this art onto these platforms and know that they're the original creator. So when it comes to something as simple as IP and knowing that I produce this, I'm the original artist for this, and I have the rights to sell this, there's no digitally native way to advance the scale of that level of digital transformation without something like this being able to come in under it and say, look, this is where the art came from. I produced it in this application or with this camera or what have you. And you can start to trace the creation of that data or that digital art to the point of production, to a marketplace, to a sale, et cetera, and know that everybody that's interacted with it has been compliant or is verifiable to some degree.
And just, an observation to extend what Matt's saying here is this is not just an enterprise issue. This is a social issue as well. We've seen the problems that are caused by things like fake news and deep fake media. I mean, you can go out and just see the sort of fake Tom Cruise that was generated using the GANs that way. Being able to go back and verify where something came from also allows us to establish sort of social, I don't want to say truth because that's way too strong, but at least some notion of what the integrity is of the media that I'm consuming. And so that is both from the producer of the media trying to monetize it, but it's also for the consumer who's trying to establish the trustworthiness of it.
I noticed there was a question in the Q&A that I think both Matt and Mick touched upon in the sense is can trust fabrics influence or touch the average consumer, right? And I think the idea of a trust fabric was born in an IoT context, right? We were thinking about all these sensors, millions and millions of them spitting out data and having some way to verify the trustworthiness. But Matt just said, hey, well, if a person is producing artwork and you want to track the provenance of the creation of the art all the way to a purchase, that helps the consumers if they really know who the identity is. And Mick, your example as well can be thought of in a consumer environment, right? People trying to consume news and having some sort of confidence in what they're reading or what they're seeing. There are all sorts of opportunities, right? And while we focus more on IoT and use cases such as industrial IoT, it really does overlap quite nicely with social issues.
Yeah, I mean, the amount of use cases that can come from this, we could probably spend 2-3 hours just discussing that alone until our brains go dead and we can't talk about it anymore.
There was another. Sorry, there was another question about there are examples of trust fabrics in production today, and as far as sort of open systems, there are a few that are kind of examples of this. I think it's TruePic is a content or an image registration system that allows you to at least sort of generate a hash and register a hash so that you can prove the existence of some document. And these are really, I mean, the ones that exist today tend to be very focused on sort of simple single domain kind of solutions to it. And I know some of the things we've been talking about is the sort of maturation of the trust fabric to really extend it out to a much broader set of applications. And in particular, is there a way that we can kind of aggregate the value of the information that we're collecting across more than one application that way?
And I think that's one of the things when we talk about trust fabrics, that it often can be hard to get your mind around it because it is something that's such a big idea, right? So looking for how can people understand, like, what is the toehold to actually get into this and take advantage of this technology. And that leads me to a couple of questions. And one is one is from chat. It's pretty straightforward. Is this something that you see as being a product that's available for people? Is it a service that's available? Is there a standard? Like, how should the audience think about this if this is something that they want to be able to use and take advantage of and have that in mind as they're building toward the future?
I think one way we think about it is it's an API is one way to answer the question, right? What is the API for annotating trust insertion points, right, as data is created and moves towards an application? So how do you actually record that journey and score that journey, right? Our work in the Linux Foundation on Project Alvarium has focused in that area primarily. And once you have that, you build products and solutions that integrate and use that API. So I wouldn't think of a trust fabric as a product, but a glue that helps bring together a lot of different products to build a trust fabric. That's how I like to think about it.
Okay. And can we talk? Oh, go ahead.
I think I'd agree with that that kind of logic as well, because I think it's a combination of all of them. You have to have a way to standardize how this data is ingested. So like there's going to be standard data formats and data attributes for what does the identity of a vehicle look like, or how do I check the health on batteries before we put them through a recycling process, or how do I verify climate data and know that this organization isn't greenwashing. There's a really granular level of standardization that has to happen that's horizontal to every industry. But then there's also going to be more contextual standards and de facto standards that come on top of that, where an industry like the mobility industry or supply chain industry is going to take existing standards and start to advance those for this level of digital transformation to say, this is how we interact as an industry with each other, regardless of what kind of organization you are. If you want to work in supply chains, you want to work in, energy, this is how our data is structured so that we can start to interact with each other. And the level of products that come off of that can be, something very finite or something very grand, where some of the things we're developing and testing with the pilots that we have at the IOTA Foundation are focused around climate and sustainability, creating new open services and smart contracts and functionalities that can be deployed as a service or as a product, and figuring out what that looks like moving forward, because you kind of have to build it and iterate it and test it in the real world to start to figure out how you're going to standardize it across an industry or across a horizontal landscape.
And just to point out that a lot of our answer is sort of domain specific, right? That there are trust fabrics out there today. TruePick was the one that I was thinking of. There are a number of other content registries that would serve as that. I mean, you could even argue, and some of our work is kind of looking at it this way, that a lot of the in toto and salsa work is about establishing trust in application binaries, right? By measuring and recording provenance in those application binaries. So there are domain specific examples right now, but I think what we're trying to get to with Alvarium is something that becomes a generic framework on which we can build many of these other domain specific applications. And so I think what you're seeing is not, it's not a single standard or single product right now, but a lot of people are experimenting because they recognize the need for this basic capability. And I think the question for us is there an opportunity to build something that allows coalescing of a lot of these other different kind of domain specific things so that we can get additional value out of the aggregation of the data?
And so can we talk for a second about Project Alvarium? There's been a couple questions about it as well in the chat. I know it's an effort. You guys have been involved with it for a couple of years. Last month, it rolled out as a project underneath the Linux Foundation's LF Edge umbrella. So maybe if I'm not sure, maybe Matt, you might be the right person for this, but if we can just talk a little bit about what is Project Alvarium, what are we doing with it, why LF Edge, just to give some context around that would be good.
You want to take it, Steve, or you want me to give it a shot first?
Yeah, no, I would say, just so everybody's clear, right? These three companies on the call, and ZEDEDA and VMware and many others, we spent the summer having project formation meetings, right? And as Sarah just mentioned, we finished that process and we officially launched, I believe it was in mid to late October. So Project Alvarium as an official Linux Foundation project launched within a couple months ago. We decided to join LF Edge specifically because we see the explosion of data for a lot of edge use cases, a lot of verticals like medical and healthcare, automotive, connected car, manufacturing, etc. And so now where the Alvarium project is at is we're looking to launch that technical steering committee that Mick just referenced, to build the framework that Mick just mentioned. Right. So as we move into the beginning of next year, we hope to have a steering committee in place to start defining this foundational trust fabric, API level, and standards, etc., so that it become highly reusable in the system. So in terms of have we shipped a product based on Alvarium, the answer is no. We've started to put the technology on Dell hardware example and move it to a customer who's interested in prototyping the idea, right? So that's the climate work that Matt referred to earlier. So it's early days, right? So the talk about products and implementations, as Mick mentioned, sure, there are trust fabrics out there, but in terms of an API that can facilitate as many of them as possible, it's early days of the community.
Yeah, I think something kind of important to highlight here too is, if you at Dell wanted to create this as a product and hold it to where it's Dell IP and scale it out as a Dell product, Dell could have done that, but it would have kind of squished the ability or the potential of what this had to do. And I think that's one of the things that really early in our conversations in like 2019 that got us excited is, you know, Dell and Intel as well really understand the benefit of open source and what needs to be open source versus what maybe doesn't need to be open source, and this and the impact that it can create and the potential for it to scale and create so many different kinds of products and services just made it fit really well under the Linux Foundation. And the Linux Foundation just has such a strong history of governance and advancing these kind of capabilities in a very trustworthy way that it just makes perfect sense to bring it under there. Could, you know, the same baseline framework also be under Eclipse or under Fireware, or under a lot of these other foundations as well? Yeah, and it probably will be as it continues to grow, but they'll have their domain specific standards and implementations of it outside of what we start to establish as a basis with Project Alvarium.
Yeah, and thanks for raising that issue of, you know, Dell contributing the code, because there, you know, JB has asked a question, is the API being implemented everywhere? Yes, anywhere. Yes, you can go to github.com project-alvarium, right? And you'll see the APIs for a trust fabric ready to be used, right? In a couple different languages. So there's an opportunity to experiment with this already. It's not like we're just having conversations as a community. There is code and there are applications that are actively being built right now.
Yeah, that's great. And I see that Sven has put some of the links in chat as well, if people want to go and check that out. There's some really great resources there. There's also a great video on the Alvarium website that it does a really good job succinctly of explaining what it is that some of the audience might find interesting to take a look at as well. So some of this we've covered, right? We've talked about, I think, a lot about the opportunities that can come from trust fabrics, but can we talk a little bit about some of the challenges in developing this as well? Like, what do you guys see as challenges? What are the things we need to get past? What are your thoughts around that?
So I guess I'll sort of double my answer with hopefully answering a couple of the questions from the Q&A. Okay, so it would be a boring panel if we all agreed, right? So we have to have some disagreement on things. And the question was raised on the panel is in the Q&A was, well, how do you do the scoring? You know, and what constitutes a good enough score? So the work that we've been doing is really trying to separate evidence from scoring. And I say that I'm going to claim the Intel Labs view of this right now. And, you know, I will have an opportunity to convince Matt and Steve that this is the appropriate way for Alvarium later. But for us, the scoring is separate from the evidence, and so what we're looking for principally from the trust fabric is high integrity evidence as to whether or not something should be considered trustworthy. And then we perform a computation on it, and that computation is very domain specific. And the idea is the trustworthiness of it is from the context and perspective of the consumer of the information rather than the producer of the information. That's my take on it. And I think that captures one of the really hard problems here, which is what constitutes trust? And how do we determine when something becomes trustworthy in this? And so I think this becomes part of both the architectural debate, but also about the sort of applications and API definition.
Yeah, so let Dell respond to Mr. Bowman. And I think it's a good answer, right? That I'm actually not going to argue with Mick and go into what our opinion is, but say that we haven't contributed the details of our opinion to the community yet. We wanted to focus more on the evidence piece, and the API is out there that allows you to generate that evidence of lineage and the journey. And we held back on the scoring piece until we were formed into a technical steering committee, because we don't want to be heavy-handed at Dell and to say this is the way scoring should happen, right? So we'll put out an example of how we think scoring should happen. And then the community needs to decide on the most appropriate framework, right? I think everybody agrees that we need to generate evidence, and that's what our current API does, and all the member companies are happy with that. But the scoring is going to be an interesting conversation, right? And that's why you haven't seen that code go out there yet, because we don't want to be viewed as prescriptive. This is the way that it needs to happen, right? Really, there are too many use cases for one company to come up with a framework that's the best scoring framework. So for those of you on the call who are interested, what a great time to join, right? Next year, we'll start looking at Dell's scoring proposal. And then, you know, as Mick points out, it may not be appropriate for the use cases that Intel cares about, and as well as other companies. And that'll be probably one of the more exciting parts of the Alvarium community, the scoring piece, because it's new. Think about it. We don't have many examples out there of data necessarily being scored in a way that satisfies a lot of different companies, right? Or that companies have come up with together. So we're doing something innovative and new.
Yeah, I think that's a good perspective, because I mean, what an application company or like an investment organization considers trustworthy and confidence inspiring is going to be completely different than someone that's more hardware or network focused. So there might honestly be different types of confidence scores that associate with the data as it goes through a fabric, to where a trust score for Intel and Dell to build an application or a service is completely different than what a trust score for, you know, Environment and Climate Change Canada or World Bank or any of these other organizations that are operating in the climate space. They might not give any care about that kind of scoring mechanism from the perspective of what the hardware manufacturers might be interested in. They might want something completely different that we're not even thinking about at this point. But that's also why we put it open, so that we can start to address those questions early.
Yeah, and so I think, Matt, that you're getting to one of the other questions that came in from the audience. If I'm understanding it right, so the question is, do you envision trust fabrics being purely objective, or could it be subjective depending on the domain, right? And I think that's what you're saying. Is that?
Yeah, I think the evidence handling process and how we get the evidence and the event data is objective, but I think the type of scores that come from it are going to be subjective.
Makes sense. That makes sense. So you know, we talked about scoring. We talked a little bit about, you know, this subjective aspect of it. Are there other challenges that we should highlight?
I think Tom asked a good question. Is anything less than 100% trust acceptable? Right. So the challenge of, again, when you talk about scoring, what is a score? Is it a number? Is it a percentage? And, you know, for the use cases, the customers that we've been talking to, because let's talk about a factory, right, that wants an end-to-end trust fabric from their factory floor all the way to an edge location, all the way up to the cloud. They want to build a trust fabric. The applications analyzing that data start at zero trust, because there's no technology to create evidence and there's no technology for scoring. And they may, on an application by application basis, they may define 6 or 7 or 8 different areas where trust needs to be inserted for them to feel 100% confidence, right? So in that example, 100% works, right? As you begin to deploy trusted technologies that span application all the way down to sensor generation of data, you can start to create these hot zones where there is no trust or confidence in the data, and try and build out the entire fabric until you've hit all of those trust insertion points and you've reached 100%. So we think it's a great way for to be used as a percentage if you want to set certain goals and then move your entire fabric towards those goals and know when you're done. That's one way we think a trust fabric will be used.
And just kind of similar to that, but imagining sort of a shared fabric where where we've got multiple parties that are contributing and consuming the information from it, everyone's risk tolerance is a little different. I mean, what we're trying to accomplish with the data that we're consuming is a little bit different. And yeah, the simple example that I use to describe this all the time is, if you've got one CSP that's charging you a certain amount for access to compute, but that compute is extremely reliable, and you have another CSP that's charging you half, but it's not quite as reliable in its availability. Which do you choose? And the answer is, it depends, right? It depends on what I'm trying to accomplish and what my budget is, how important it is to get the reliable systems forward on that. And I think we have to approach trust in the same way, that at some level, these are all contextual. It depends on what my risk profile is. What am I trying to do with the data? And I need to be able to compute that. I need to be able to make the decision about the trustworthiness of the data based on my sets of requirements. And Sarah, you asked about other problems on this. I think there are a bunch of sort of system problems that go along with this that are sort of application specific. Like, what's the latency? If we're trying to do industrial robotics, for example, where we're controlling the calibration of a welding machine based on the information that we're feeding in from the manufacturing floor, there are some very, very tight latency requirements that we would have to meet. That's a very different problem than if we were trying to establish trust in media. What we were talking about identifying deep fakes, where latency isn't an issue at all that way. And so I think as we mature these our understanding of the applications, there's going to be a whole different set of requirements that are going to come in. And how we address those requirements, I think, is going to be a real interesting problem.
Yeah, it's great because it's so early, right? Which is also, again, to the point that this is the right time if people in the audience want to get involved in the effort, right? To go to alvarium.org and check that out. Let's shift gears just a little bit here as we've got about 20 minutes left here. So one of the things we wanted to talk about was the relationship between trust fabrics and the secure software supply chain, right? So what is the relationship between those? How does that fit?
So this one I get to at least start the answer, and that's at least partly because this is one of our kind of active areas of research in Intel Labs right now. Is when you think of an application, you're trying to decide whether or not you've received an application binary. You're trying to decide whether or not you should run it, whether it's safe to run, and whether or not you trust it. Obviously, we have a bunch of static analysis we can perform. We can do virus scanning on it in order to make that check. But what we have seen in the industry is things like was it Tradewinds and some of these other examples that how you build the application matters, because if you build it in a high integrity way, then it's more difficult to inject malicious code into the application binary. So in some sense, what I really want to do is to establish the trustworthiness of this application. Was it built from the source that I believed it was built from? And to what extent did it have opportunities to be modified as it was transformed through the system and ultimately communicated to me? So even something like that becomes kind of a question of trust in the data that I'm receiving. And you might say with the applications, we kind of have, we have frameworks for kind of doing this. This is what I was referring to, like in Toto is trying to do some things like this so that we can trace back the lineage of an application with it. But there are a bunch of more challenging situations, again, sort of back to the latency question. If I'm trying to run a microservice and I have millisecond latency requirements for it, I don't have time to do the kind of static analysis. What I really need to do is to project forward, and this is where I get to actually agree with Steve on the scoring pieces of it that comes through. What I need is somebody to give me the answer because I don't have time to go compute it, right, on the fly. And so there are a bunch of these sort of problems that come up when we start treating applications as data that are very much in line with the trust fabric that we're talking about for computing on data generated at the edge. It's a very similar kind of problem.
And Mick, I had a question as you were talking, is how do you think about, how does Intel position the use of their own trusted products, right? Their trusted silicon, for example, as part of the generation of a secure application or a trustworthy application?
Yeah, that's a great question, and let's just back up for a second. So what we're really talking about is this notion of trusted execution environments, and it's not just Intel. AMD has SEV, ARM has TrustZone, and the idea is that we create a way for executing on encrypted data inside the processor, which protects it from the host. And that gives us really two good properties. One is high integrity, and the second is confidentiality on the processing of it. So in theory, that means that if we perform some computation inside a TEE, inside one of these trusted execution environments, we can make stronger claims about the integrity of the computation that was performed. So if we collect something from a sensor and we have a secure path into the processor and we sign it, then the signature on that data is more trustworthy than if we were collecting it over an insecure connection, performing the computation on an insecure processor. Any one of those places where we could inject a bogus signature or modify the data along the way. So that being said, when we look at the TEEs, what we really do, the approach we usually take with TEEs is that it doesn't make guarantees about trustworthiness, but it increases the likelihood that the computation was trustworthy. And so this is where we've been talking about how we adjust the trustworthiness score or how we interpret the evidence. If, for example, we run a compilation inside a trusted execution environment, the binary that's created in some sense is harder to modify than if we did it in a kind of untrusted processor.
Yeah, the reason I asked is because I think it's a great example. If you have binary A and binary B, and A has not been generated through a trust fabric. When you ask for a confidence score, there is none, or if you ask for evidence, there is none. But for B, if it has gone through a trust fabric, you can ask it and it can say, well, yes, I was encrypted, I traveled through a TEE, here's a signature of either the chip or the vendor that participated with it that gives you the accountability. And that's not possible today, right? To go up to a binary and query it for its, the trustworthiness of its generation, which I think is pretty exciting.
Or the best you can do today is you hope it's been out in the community long enough that enough other people have done it that nobody's recognized it. And that's kind of flaky, but that's kind of the approach that we do most of the time today. So,
yeah, not good enough, right?
No, not good enough.
Yeah, and I mean, this kind of goes back to the objective versus subjective perspective as well, because even though something's executed in a trusted execution environment, that doesn't mean that there's not vulnerabilities associated with that trusted execution environment. Some are better than others in different ways. Some have different vulnerabilities than others. So one person may say, oh, because it was executed in a trusted execution environment, then I think that's 100%, confidence in that data. Where another person who's more familiar with the vulnerabilities and the different issues that can come around that could still subject the data to manipulation or what have you, might say, that helps, but it's still not ironclad. So it helps us understand from an operational and from an industry perspective, like, what do we really need to focus on holistically to start to advance what confidence means, where are the big gaps in how devices interact with each other and how we process data. Really starts to give us a big strategic perspective of where industry resources need to be focusing.
I noticed a great question here, guys, too, and it's specific to IOTA as a DLT. We're talking about the capture of evidence in a distributed ledger. And when we built our first fabric, we at Dell used VMware's blockchain because we're a close partner with them. And it was a permission blockchain, and we wanted to look at some public DLTs. And Matt, that's where we recognized IOTA's distributed graph ledger. And the question is, well, what if you have performance bottlenecks, right? And you're in the need to get latency out of the ledger, or how fast you can query the ledger. And a lot of people don't realize that Alvarium is designed to be ledger neutral, right? So the API that we've used to write annotations to a ledger can go to IOTA, as well as any other ledger that may have different characteristics, right? So what are you seeing, Matt, in terms of when does IOTA's ledger tend to get used, right? What use cases are it's designed for that could be best when you're thinking about Alvarium annotations?
Yeah, so I think a few key points is, one, the ability to do all these things in parallel and in near real time. When you're implementing something like this into as many potential devices as we're talking about Alvarium integrating into its scale, potentially millions or billions of IoT devices or APIs, et cetera, you need something that, one, has a really low latency that can transact in real time and have finality around that. You also need the ability for it to happen in parallel. So for it to send it to potentially multiple resources or multiple devices at the same time. You also don't want to have infrastructure or network bottlenecks or barriers, such as fees that would stop something from happening or make it not valuable enough to send these kind of data verification transactions over the network. Like if it costs you $20 to send something from one device to another, then that might impact the value of the confidence scores to a point where you can't even get those confidence scores in the first place. So when we initially talked to y'all, that was a lot of the highlights from the IOTA perspective, but other people might not see it the same way. They might see something like Ethereum or like Hyperledger fitting their use case better. And when we designed all this with you, we were very adherent to like, how do we design it and test it on IOTA, but also make it replicable to an Ethereum or Solana or Polkadot or any of the other blockchains out there. Because the customers are always going to be right in that situation. If they want to use a different blockchain, they need to have the ability to use that. Or if they want to use this to verify something across different blockchains, which is where I think it gets really interesting from our side. How do we use things like Alvarium as a bridge between a chain link and IOTA to establish different types of oracles, or an Ethereum and IOTA to figure out if the smart contract executed here and it executed here, does it have the same output, and what's our confidence in that?
So one of the questions from the audience then that I will ask you, Matt, is there going to be some sort of official collaboration between IOTA and Intel or IOTA and Dell?
Well, I mean, what do you define as an official collaboration?
Well, Alvarium's official.
That's it.
Right?
Yeah.
all three companies, right, officially contributed a quote to the announcement of in our support for it. But I would also say, from the Dell IOTA perspective, as I mentioned earlier, right, we're taking some Dell hardware, taking our IOTA integration and shipping it to a customer that's looking at the trustworthiness of environmental data, right? Mick just showed up a couple weeks ago to talk about this secure software supply chain and asked who in the community would like to work on this with us, right? And that could be IOTA, could be Dell, could be both, right? So there will be much more stuff in flight as we move into 2022.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think that, again, to echo what Steve's saying, is that the nice part about having an open source community this way is that we're committed to the community. There may be separate business relationships if they are appropriate to accomplish what we want to accomplish out of it. But really, I think the focus for all of us is making the open source community successful. And that includes not just the three companies represented here, but as we've said, VMware and the others who are participating and contributing to the discussions on the architecture for Alvarium. It is a community process, and it's the commitment to the community that matters.
Yeah, and that's kind of why I asked, what do we define as official? Because official collaboration is what Alvarium is. All the members that are collaborating on Alvarium are doing so officially. They're all members of the Linux Foundation. They're all members of LFEdge. They're all active in the project, and they're contributing either thoughts, feedback, or development resources to building it out. So I see that as a very fruitful and beneficial official collaboration for everybody. But there's a lot of different perspectives to look at that. Is it an official collaboration for us to launch a joint product and scale a service? We haven't gotten to that point yet, but this is a new innovation and a new technology solving a lot of big problems, and it could get to that point at some point.
Okay. And I'm going to throw out another question from the audience, and I'm not sure which of you might be the right person to answer this. But the question is, have you considered using an open source app embedded zero trust connectivity so that all the APIs can be dark to external sources, and increasing the trust of data that comes from a source or assistant component that is dark?
I would answer that I would answer that we would consider, right? So if you look at, again, when you have an initial open source contribution that Dell did to this summer, right, when we contributed the code, we don't want to be too opinionated and we don't want to be too advanced, right? We want to give all the companies an opportunity to, to get more robust, which is the suggestion here that we have. Right? Can we do some robust operations in Alvarium that makes it more secure? So we haven't considered embedding that zero trust connectivity yet, but we're certainly open to learning more about how it could be used and then deciding if it will be used.
Yeah, and there's certainly nothing that precludes that capability being added to what we're doing, but as you said, it's going to be based on the requirements for those who are building it.
Yeah, and I think from our perspective, that goes in the direction of, how did zero knowledge proofs or ZK snarks or any of these other like homomorphic encryption, those really advanced secure capabilities come into a framework like this. Because those are definitely the types of things that we from the IOTA Foundation are looking at really concretely, seeing how do we take this to the next phase from decentralization, anonymity, and security and privacy, build these kind of capabilities in as options so that if you want to have a full ZK snark enabled trust fabric, you could actually implement something like that. Because doing something like supplying data autonomously to an energy grid might need a really high level of privacy and anonymity, and might really be beneficial or might really benefit from those types of integrations down the road. But that's also an opportunity for organizations that are building those capabilities to come into Alvarium and say, hey, this is how we could see that actually contributing to the project, or how we would like to collaborate openly.
Yeah, that's great. And I think that might be, as we're coming up sort of to the end of this here, that might also be a really good place to leave it, right? That actively looking at what are the requirements. This is the time for people to join if they want to become part of that effort. You can go to alvarium.org or you can go to lfedge.org and find tons more information about it and get involved in that. Any last thoughts from any of you that you'd like to add?
Just the last question that came in, AMD has attended our meetings. HP has a member HP in a meeting. When we look at companies like Microsoft, I think of Microsoft, Google, Amazon as these cloud vendors who are creating paths from sensors up to their clouds. And Google has attended our meetings, so I think that there'll be interest from the cloud players once the word gets out and there's more code forming and there's more opportunities for them to insert trust on the journey that data takes from an IoT sensor up to the cloud, for example. So I think we've already seen a lot of the companies that are in this question, and we anticipate there'll be more.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that kind of brings on a quote that I really like from Jason, and that you have utilized a lot as well from the Dell perspective, is no one's going to own the edge. No one organization, no one cloud entity, no one infrastructure provider is ever going to own the edge. It's too big, it's too fragmented, there's too many industries and ecosystems. So with the cloud providers and those types of members specifically, that's where interoperability becomes a really big point. Is, you know, you want Google capabilities to integrate with AWS capabilities, to integrate with Azure and Oracle and IBM. You want those to kind of be interoperable at some point, and none of them are going to own everything. So them coming in is a big strategic perspective for them as well, to say, how do we make sure that it's as easy as possible to bring these kind of capabilities into their platforms, and then they can scale out their own types of services and products off of it.
Yeah, it's a huge ecosystem, right? And everybody has their place to play within that, but we have to do it in such a way that makes it possible for us to have that interoperability and make sure that people have the choices that they need to choose the right technology, right? Yeah, absolutely. Which is, again, gets back to I think Alvarium coming into LF Edge as well, and making it an official Linux Foundation project as well. On that note, then let's go ahead and wrap it up. Steve, Mick, Matt, thank you so much for your time. I think this was super informative for me. Hopefully it was for the audience as well. For the audience, if there's any questions we didn't get to, we'll follow up via email after the webinar concludes. And we'll also have this webinar available on demand probably early next week, and we'll share that out to everyone as well. But to the panelists, thank you so much for your time today. And everyone, have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Sarah.
Bye all.
Take care.
Happy holidays.
Happy holidays.